Hollywood's golden age sparkled with stars and stories. Yet hidden beneath the surface, a darker world whispered its influence. The Mafia's grip wasn't just on casinos and clubs, it stretched onto red carpets and into sound stages. These weren't just celebrities, they were players, willing or not, in a deadly game of power, secrets, and survival. Here are 20 Golden Age Hollywood stars whose lives crossed paths with organized crime. 1. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra wasn't merely a singer, he was a cultural storm, a voice that echoed through generations, commanding attention on stages, in films, and behind political curtains. But behind the tuxedo and spotlight, Sinatra's name regularly surfaced in hushed conversations about the Mafia. From the 1940s onward, Sinatra was rumored to be close with notorious underworld figures like Lucky Luciano, Sam Giancana, and Johnny Roselli. FBI files thickened with notes on his movements, his acquaintances, and the venues where he performed. Venues often controlled by mob families. Sinatra never admitted any criminal ties, but his proximity was undeniable. Las Vegas was his playground. The Sands, the Riviera, these weren't just performance halls, they were mob-managed enterprises. Sinatra wasn't just an act, he was an investment, and in return, he reaped unspoken privileges, protection, prestige, and a platform that magnified his career. Perhaps most explosively, during JFK's 1960 presidential campaign, Sinatra was accused of arranging labor support through his mob contacts. After Kennedy won, the family cut ties, afraid of the political fallout. Sinatra was reportedly devastated, especially when he had to be told indirectly that JFK wouldn't be staying at his Palm Springs estate. His fallout with the Kennedys even ended his friendship with Peter Lawford, the man sent to deliver the message. Then came The Godfather. The character Johnny Fontaine, a crooner who asks the Mafia for help landing a film role, was widely believed to be based on Sinatra. He was so incensed, he allegedly tried to halt the film's production. Frank Sinatra's legacy is immortal. But behind the velvet voice lies the shadow of a man whose career soared while navigating one of the darkest undercurrents in American history. 2. Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe was the ultimate Hollywood icon. Beauty, vulnerability, and mystery all wrapped in one radiant figure. But beyond the camera flashes and studio lots, Monroe moved dangerously close to a world ruled not by directors or producers, but by mob bosses. Though she was never formally linked to organized crime, Monroe's associations sparked decades of speculation. Her romantic connections to both John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy have long been chronicled, but what's often overshadowed is the alleged Mafia ties tied to the Kennedy family. Mob kingpins like Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli were believed to have helped JFK win the presidency. That same circle of influence was whispered to have kept tabs on Monroe, maybe out of interest, maybe out of caution. FBI files reveal Monroe was under federal observation, with officials worried about her knowledge of sensitive political and criminal secrets. Monroe also had a strong presence in Las Vegas, where she frequented nightclubs and performed at venues operated by mob-run syndicates. She moved through a world choreographed by powerful men, many of whom operated far from the cameras. Then came her tragic death in 1962, ruled a probable overdose, yet riddled with questions. Conspiracy theories swirled. Had she heard too much? Did her romantic entanglements place her at the center of a dangerous political and criminal triangle? Her death may forever remain a mystery. But the questions endure because the connections were too powerful to ignore. Marilyn Monroe was a dream sold to the world. But behind that dream was a reality soaked in secrets. power plays, and a silent reach that may have stretched much farther than anyone dared admit. 3. George Raft. George Raft wasn't just good at playing gangsters, he practically invented the archetype. But his off-screen persona was even more dangerous. Born in the rough streets of Hell's Kitchen, Raft grew up among real-life mobsters long before he shared the screen with fictional ones. Before Hollywood, Raft ran in circles with the likes of Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky. He was known in the underworld, respected even. When he exploded onto the screen in films like Scarface, 1932, his portrayals were so authentic, many suspected he wasn't acting at all. Insiders claimed Raft maintained these ties throughout his career. He was spotted dining with mob figures, attending underground parties, and allegedly mediating disputes between the criminal world and the entertainment industry. Studio heads became nervous. Some roles he reportedly turned down because they too closely resembled real-life mob associates. In one particularly serious case, the British government denied him entry in the UK, citing his known associations with organized crime. A rare move against an American film star. Despite all this, Raft was never charged with any crime. He always denied involvement, framing his mob ties as youthful friendships. But few believed that was the whole truth. George Raft was a man with one foot on the red carpet and the other in the back rooms of smoky clubs, bridging two worlds that rarely acknowledged one another. In him, Hollywood didn't just imitate life, it stared into its underworld reflection. 4. Tony Curtis. Tony Curtis was the definition of charisma, silver screen charm wrapped in a sharp suit, and an even sharper smile. But long before he became a Hollywood heartthrob, he was Bernard Schwartz, a streetwise kid from the Bronx. And in the Bronx, your neighbors weren't just regular folks, they included names like Bugsy Siegel. According to Curtis, his family knew Siegel personally. As a child, he watched how power operated in whispered conversations and shadowy deals. These weren't bedtime stories, they were survival lessons. As his fame grew, Curtis found himself working in Las Vegas, a city pulsing with mob control. He performed in casinos where the real bosses didn't sit in the audience. They owned the stage. He rubbed shoulders with the Rat Pack, was seen at mob-frequented events, and maintained ties to men whose reputations came with bodyguards and silence. While Curtis never faced criminal charges, there were whispers that he was quietly protected by old acquaintances, friends from the Bronx who hadn't forgotten him. Whether those whispers were myth or fact didn't matter. What mattered was the perception. Tony Curtis was untouchable. In interviews, he never shied away from his past. He spoke with pride about growing up tough, knowing how to read a room, and surviving in a business that could eat you alive. Curtis brought grit to glamour, and maybe that's why he fit so perfectly in a world where the glint of a spotlight was sometimes rivaled by the gleam of a pistol under a dinner jacket. 5. Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor was more than a movie star, she was Hollywood royalty. With violet eyes and a fiery will, she became an icon of beauty, scandal, and success. But her story, too, glides close to the undercurrents of organized crime. Taylor's connections weren't direct, but they were undeniable. Through her marriages and friendships, she moved in circles that blended stardom with mob influence. Her husband, Eddie Fisher, regularly performed in clubs operated by known Mafia figures. Later, her legendary romance with Richard Burton kept her in Vegas and New York social scenes where the mob's shadow loomed large. Then there was Frank Sinatra, a close friend of Taylor's for years. Sinatra's documented links to Sam Giancana and other mobsters ensured that anyone in his circle, especially a star like Elizabeth Taylor, was at least aware of who ran the room. Taylor attended events and parties where power gathered, political elites, entertainment giants, and those who operated from behind smoked glass doors. According to some biographers, she was once present at a gathering where both entertainers and underworld bosses mingled freely. But Elizabeth was no one's pawn. Fiercely independent, she refused to be manipulated. Friends say she was observant and calculating, charming the room but never losing control of her image. In a world where mob figures saw celebrities as assets to flaunt or control, Elizabeth Taylor remained an enigma, too powerful to own, too elegant to intimidate. 6. Dean Martin. Dean Martin didn't just define cool. He was the blueprint. Whether singing smooth ballads or cracking wise as part of the Rat Pack, Martin had a casual charm that seemed effortless. But behind his laid-back persona was a man who understood the dangers of asking too many questions. Martin was a frequent headliner in Las Vegas during its golden era, when the Strip was run not by tourism boards but by mob syndicates. He played at the Sands, the Riviera, the Flamingo, venues backed by Mafia money and guarded by silent rules. These weren't just glamorous hotels. They were operations, and Martin was a prized asset. Unlike Sinatra, who was vocal and fiery in his relationships with mob-connected figures, Martin took the opposite route: quiet, professional, and fiercely discreet. That silence earned him a unique place of trust. He showed up, delivered unforgettable performances, and didn't meddle in matters behind the curtain. Some biographers suggest Martin was seen by mob bosses as the perfect performer: loyal, reliable, and apolitical. He didn't court controversy. He didn't create problems. And in a town where your next gig could depend on who owed whom a favor, that reputation mattered more than fame. Though never linked to any crime, Martin's proximity to mob-run venues and relationships with key figures in the Rat Pack made him a familiar face in rooms where danger lingered just beyond the spotlight. Dean Martin knew the game, and he played it like he played everything: smooth, steady, and just far enough from the fire to never get burned. 7. Clark Gable. Clark Gable was the undisputed king of Hollywood. With his chiseled jaw, commanding presence, and magnetic screen appeal, Gable captured the hearts of audiences around the world. But behind the grandeur, Gable's journey through Hollywood intersected with figures whose power wasn't scripted. It was enforced. Though Gable's mob ties were never center stage, his early rise through the studio system placed him in proximity to unions and film crew organizations heavily influenced by the Mafia. During the 1930s and 1940s, Hollywood labor was a battlefield. Studios fought for control, and the mob saw an opportunity. Film projectionists, theater chains, and even catering crews fell under mob oversight. Gable, as a leading man and studio favorite, was often protected from the ugliest fights, but he wasn't unaware. Biographers suggest that Gable knew who made the calls behind the scenes and understood that a friendly nod or a refusal to rock the boat was often the difference between security and sabotage. He was also a frequent guest at elite Hollywood parties, where mob-connected producers and financiers mingled with actors, directors, and agents. The lines between legitimate business and underworld influence were blurred, and Gable walked that line with grace, charm, and a deep instinct for self-preservation. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Gable avoided scandal and confrontation, but his ability to remain untouched in an era rife with power struggles hinted at more than luck. It hinted at understanding. In a city where charm could deflect suspicion, Clark Gable wore his crown not just with elegance, but with survivalist wisdom. 8th, Vic Damone. Vic Damone's voice was liquid velvet, a romantic tenor who captivated audiences coast to coast, Damone seemed born to serenade hearts under soft lights. But early in his career, his golden voice nearly led him into a deadly silence. In a rare, candid interview years later, Damone revealed a chilling encounter with the mob. After canceling a club booking he felt uneasy about, he was reportedly abducted, taken on a drive by men with ties to the New York underworld. The message was clear. Contracts weren't suggestions. He was told in no uncertain terms to reconsider, or else. His escape didn't come from luck. It came from a powerful intervention. Frank Costello, one of the most influential mob bosses in America, allegedly called in a favor and ordered Damone's release, calling him a good kid. Whether out of kindness or strategy, the gesture saved Damone's life and altered the trajectory of his career. Even after that brush with danger, Damone continued performing in mob-run venues in Las Vegas, Miami, and Chicago. It was the only way forward. The entertainment industry in those cities was sewn together with Mafia threads. And Damone, like many of his era, had to choose: risk everything or play the game quietly. He was never involved in crime, but his survival and his career became a quiet example of how deep the Mafia's reach extended, even into a song. Vic Damone wasn't a gangster. He was a singer with a gift, but that gift almost cost him everything in a world where backing out could be a death sentence. 9. Lana Turner. Lana Turner's beauty was legendary. Ice-blonde hair, haunting eyes, and a screen presence that could halt time. But behind the glamour was a story ripped from a noir screenplay, complete with danger, scandal, and a man who answered not to casting directors, but to mob bosses. That man was Johnny Stompanato, Turner's lover, and a known associate of Los Angeles crime figure Mickey Cohen. Tall, handsome, and well-dressed, Stompanato wasn't just a playboy. He was an enforcer. And when he entered Turner's life, everything changed. Friends said he controlled her every move, what she wore, who she saw, which roles she took. His presence at Hollywood parties was chilling. Everyone knew who he was, and everyone feared what he could do. Then came the fateful night, in 1958. A heated argument between Turner and Stompanato escalated, and her teenage daughter, Cheryl Crane, allegedly intervened with a knife. Stompanato was killed. The trial became a media circus. Though Cheryl was acquitted, the incident exposed the stark reality of Turner's life, one where glamour couldn't shield her from real-world violence. Hollywood gasped. One of its most beloved stars had been intimately tied to the underworld, not as a distant acquaintance, but as a victim caught in its grip. Turner's career never fully recovered. Though she continued acting, the tragedy shadowed her legacy. Yet it also made her story unforgettable. Lana Turner wasn't naive. She was a star navigating a world that mixed power, fear, and affection in equal parts. And in doing so, she became the cautionary tale of how close the Mafia's touch could come to Hollywood's brightest lights. 10th. Peter Lawford. Peter Lawford had the charm of British nobility and the swagger of a Rat Pack regular. But beneath the polished exterior was a man caught between politics, performance, and power, and crushed by all three. Married to Patricia Kennedy, sister of John F. Kennedy, Lawford became the bridge between Hollywood and the White House. His friendships with Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Sammy Davis Jr. gave him access to the Rat Pack's inner sanctum. But that inner circle also included names like Sam Giancana, the Chicago mob boss with deep ties to entertainment and union muscle. Lawford played host, fixer, and messenger, allegedly coordinating appearances and introductions between the Kennedy campaign and entertainers connected to underworld figures. It was a dangerous dance, one that couldn't last. When JFK won the presidency, the family began severing ties with Sinatra due to his Mafia connections. Lawford was tasked with delivering the bad news. The president would no longer stay at Sinatra's estate. Sinatra was furious, and Lawford was exiled. The Rat Pack turned cold. Lawford, once a golden thread tying together glamour and power, was suddenly irrelevant. Though he never faced legal scrutiny, his fall from grace was swift. He lived the rest of his life haunted by what-ifs, left with nothing but memories of what had been. Peter Lawford didn't make the rules, but for a time, he was the man who enforced them. And when the game changed, he learned the hard way. Those who stand between two kingdoms are often the first to be sacrificed. 11. Eddie Fisher. Eddie Fisher had the golden voice of the 1950s. His ballads dominated radio waves, and his clean-cut image made him America's sweetheart. But beneath the pop star polish, Fisher's rise was intimately tied to a world most fans never saw: the mob's empire of nightclubs, casinos, and backroom deals. Fisher's early performances took him to Las Vegas, Miami, and New York, cities where the most prestigious stages were operated by Mafia families. The Sands, the Tropicana, and the Copacabana weren't just music venues. They were mob businesses, often used for laundering money or consolidating power. And Fisher was a regular act in them. But Fisher's relationship with the mob went beyond simple bookings. According to multiple industry insiders, his tours were sometimes managed by intermediaries known for their underworld ties. Certain agents and promoters who favored Fisher reportedly had long histories with organized crime families. Though Fisher was never directly implicated in criminal activity, law enforcement documents mention his name in relation to these venues. The implication wasn't guilt, it was presence. And in that world, presence alone could be everything. His marriages, first to Debbie Reynolds, then to Elizabeth Taylor, kept him in the public eye. But they also brought him deeper into Hollywood's elite social circles, where the line between celebrity and influence was razor-thin. Fisher walked that line without ever tripping, at least publicly. In interviews, he rarely discussed his mob connections, but those who knew him understood. Fisher didn't just perform in the mob's playground, he thrived there. Behind the spotlight, Eddie Fisher knew the rules of survival: sing well, show up, and never ask who owned the stage. 12. Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr. was a showbiz powerhouse: dancer, singer, actor, and trailblazer. As the only black member of the Rat Pack, Davis shattered racial barriers on stage while navigating a behind-the-scenes world tightly controlled by organized crime. His rise coincided with the golden age of Las Vegas, a city where mob bosses pulled every lever behind the glittering facades of casino stages. Davis performed nightly at places like the Sands and the Flamingo, venues openly operated by Mafia families from Chicago and New York. These weren't just performance halls. They were business hubs, and Davis was their prized entertainer. His association with Frank Sinatra brought him into the Rat Pack's inner circle, and with it came proximity to figures like Sam Giancana and Johnny Rosselli, men who weren't just guests backstage, but silent stakeholders in the city's profits. Davis's position was complicated. Despite his fame, he faced racism at every turn, often forbidden to stay in the very hotels he headlined. Yet some believe mob-affiliated figures actually treated him with more fairness than the mainstream establishment. In a world where skin color shut doors, power, no matter how dark its origin, sometimes opened them. There's no evidence Davis was involved in any illicit dealings, but his livelihood depended on pleasing both audiences and unseen bosses. He walked a tightrope between applause and obligation. In a city built on chance, Sammy Davis Jr. played every night like his life depended on it, because in the shadows of the strip, it just might have .13. Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis was comedy, incarnate, slapstick, energetic, and unapologetically outrageous. From his early duo act with Dean Martin to his solo superstardom, Lewis was a force of nature. But while audiences laughed, few realized he was performing on stages where the stakes were anything but funny. Las Vegas was Lewis's second home in the 1950s and 60s. The Sands, the Flamingo, the Riviera. His name lit up marquees at venues built, financed, or protected by Mafia families. For comedians like Lewis, these weren't just gigs. They were contracts steeped in silent expectations. Mob influence was everywhere. Performers who brought in profits were valuable, but only as long as they kept the peace. Lewis, with his knack for bringing in massive crowds, was a dream act, and his longtime ties to Rat Pack figures, especially Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, meant he was trusted by the right people. While never associated with criminal activity, Lewis knew who ran the show. He avoided political statements, backstage drama, and unnecessary alliances. His focus was singular: make people laugh, no matter who was watching. Later in life, Lewis would be praised for his philanthropy, especially his work with the Muscular Dystrophy Association. But even those events, when held in Vegas, had to navigate the city's complex web of influence. Jerry Lewis survived not because he played dumb, but because he played smart. In a town where the mob decided who stayed and who disappeared, keeping the jokes coming was more than entertainment. It was insurance. 14. James Cagney. James Cagney wasn't just a movie gangster, he was the gangster, snarling his way through classics like The Public Enemy and Angels with Dirty Faces. But off-screen, he found himself in conflict with real-world mob figures who didn't take no for an answer. In the 1930s and 40s, Hollywood unions were powerful, and many were infiltrated or controlled outright by organized crime. Projectionists, crew members, and even hairdressers often operated under the eye of mob-influenced leaders. Cagney, fiercely independent and famously stubborn, refused to cooperate. According to his autobiography and several biographers, Cagney was pressured to comply with union demands backed by mob threats. He resisted, and when things got dangerous, it was George Raft, his real-life friend and former underworld insider, who allegedly stepped in. Raft's involvement, whispered to be more than a friendly warning, reportedly ended the problem overnight. Though Cagney was never implicated in mob dealings, his FBI file grew thick with notes from the labor wars that swept through Hollywood. His vocal stance against corruption earned him enemies, but also respect. Unlike many stars who played nice to protect their careers, Cagney stood firm. He spoke out, stayed independent, and somehow kept working, an outcome many attribute to powerful friends in low places. James Cagney didn't just play the tough guy. He was one. And in a town where saying no could cost you everything, he walked away with his pride intact and his legend secured. 15. Judy Garland. Judy Garland was Hollywood's tragic angel, a voice that could move mountains and a soul burdened by fame, addiction, and pressure. But in the later years of her career, when the studios stopped calling, Garland turned to the only venues that still welcomed her: mob-run nightclubs. Las Vegas, Chicago, and New York became her stage, cities where powerful crime families controlled nearly every marquee. Garland was no stranger to these circles. She performed in clubs operated by syndicates that dictated not just ticket prices, but the careers of those they allowed to shine. For Garland, these gigs weren't just bookings, they were lifelines. Struggling with finances, health issues, and tabloid scandals, she needed the work. And the mob needed stars who could fill seats. The arrangement was understood: silent, profitable, and dangerous to challenge. Some sources suggest she received help navigating shady promoters or recovering debts, all orchestrated by figures who never appeared in the playbill. There were even rumors, never confirmed, of romantic entanglements with men tied to the underworld. Garland was never involved in crime, but she performed in a system shaped by it, and like many in her era, she paid the price for proximity. Her voice shook theaters, her eyes revealed heartbreak, and her life, like her songs, danced along the edge of light and shadow. 16. Joey Bishop. Joey Bishop was never the loudest voice in the Rat Pack. While Sinatra dazzled and Dean Martin charmed, Bishop kept a calm, calculated presence. But make no mistake, he knew exactly what was going on around him, and that quiet might have been what kept him safe. As the Rat Pack's go-to MC and opening act, Bishop was a constant presence at Las Vegas venues like the Sands and the Riviera, casinos known to be controlled or financed by powerful mob families from Chicago, New York, and Cleveland. These weren't just showrooms. They were criminal enterprises disguised in sequins and neon. Bishop wasn't flashy. He didn't party hard or draw attention. He showed up, delivered tight comedy, and vanished into the shadows. But his name still appeared in FBI files, tied not to crimes, but to known associates and frequent appearances in mob-run spaces. Insiders suggest that Bishop's survival and longevity in such a high-risk environment was no accident. He understood the unspoken rules: never talk back, never talk out of turn, and never make anyone lose money. That's how you stayed booked. That's how you stayed breathing. Though he was never directly involved in illicit dealings, Joey Bishop walked a tightrope every night he stood under Vegas lights. He did his job, kept his head down, and in doing so, became the most quietly powerful member of the Rat Pack. In a world where silence was golden and often life-saving, Bishop knew that being funny was important, but staying quiet was essential. 17. Humphrey Bogart. Humphrey Bogart was the original Hollywood tough guy. Casablanca, The Maltese Falcon, The Big Sleep. He made cynicism and cigarette smoke look noble. But in real life, Bogart didn't just play characters who brushed against danger. He lived among it. Though not often tied to organized crime himself, Bogart ran in circles where mob influence was simply part of the scenery. His early years in New York placed him near Prohibition-era bootleggers and gamblers, men who shaped the underground world of clubs and speakeasies. When he transitioned to Hollywood, those connections followed. Bogart's films often portrayed the criminal underworld, and that authenticity didn't come solely from acting. He was friends with George Raft, a man known for his deep ties to real-life gangsters. Some reports even suggest Raft once stepped in on Bogart's behalf during a labor dispute that had quietly escalated into something more threatening. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Bogart didn't perform in mob-controlled casinos. He preferred the studio system and steered clear of Vegas showrooms. But his fame attracted attention. Mob figures often sought the company of stars, and Bogart was regularly seen at parties hosted by producers and financiers known to be mob-connected. His solution? Distance and deflection. Bogart never courted the spotlight off-screen, rarely attended large events, and kept his private life guarded. It was a strategy that allowed him to remain beloved and untouched. Humphrey Bogart played men who walked the edge. In real life, he walked it too, but always knew when to step back. 18. Robert Mitchum. Robert Mitchum oozed danger. His sleepy eyes, gravelly voice, and unbothered demeanor made him the ultimate screen rebel. And off-screen, he wasn't much different. Mitchum lived by his own rules, and those rules sometimes brought him close to very dangerous people. Mitchum never denied that his social life included gamblers, night owls, and men whose businesses weren't always legal. He partied in Las Vegas, headlined at clubs with known mob affiliations, and frequented Hollywood gatherings where crime bosses and A-listers mingled freely. In 1948, Mitchum was arrested in a marijuana bust that rocked Hollywood. He spent time in jail, but made a remarkably fast comeback. Some speculated he had help, possibly from powerful figures who didn't want their favorite tough guy caught up in scandal. No proof ever surfaced. But the rumors persisted. Mitchum also benefited from friendships with people like George Raft, who was rumored to have offered protection when needed. He never elaborated, never explained, and never apologized. That mystique only added to his legend. Mitchum wasn't flashy or political. He didn't chase headlines or endorsements, but he also didn't flinch when the room filled with men carrying secrets. In fact, he was often the most comfortable man there. Robert Mitchum didn't pretend to be clean-cut. He embraced the gray, on screen and off. And in a town crawling with sharks, he survived by swimming with them and keeping his mouth shut. 19th, Tony Bennett. Tony Bennett was class personified. His voice, silky, refined, soulful, brought sophistication to every stage he graced. But in the 1950s and 60s, those stages were often owned or controlled by America's most feared underworld figures. Bennett was a regular at Las Vegas casinos, New York nightclubs, and Chicago hotels, locations long dominated by mob families. These weren't just glamorous venues. They were laundering machines, union battlegrounds, and safe havens for syndicate cash flow. Yet, Bennett avoided scandal throughout his decades-long career. How? He understood the environment and adapted. In interviews, he later admitted that you knew who was behind the scenes, but you didn't talk about it. That code of silence wasn't cowardice, it was survival. Unlike others who partied with gangsters or took favors, Bennett kept to the music. He was polite, punctual, and uncontroversial. Mob bosses liked him because he made them money. He liked the audiences. It was an unspoken arrangement. There were whispers, never confirmed, that he turned down questionable deals or was warned about certain promoters. But Bennett always avoided direct conflict. He simply sang, bowed, and left the politics to others. Tony Bennett proved that even in a world of shadows, you could shine without compromise. But you had to be smart enough to never challenge the hand feeding the spotlight. 20th. Mickey Rooney. Mickey Rooney was once Hollywood's biggest star. As a child actor, he lit up screens with charm and energy. But behind that wholesome image was a life surrounded by chaos, and perhaps a guardian angel with mob connections. During a turbulent stretch in Rooney's career, he reportedly got into a dispute with a powerful studio executive. The details remain murky, but what followed was even more intriguing. According to multiple tell-alls and biographies, Bugsy Siegel, the feared mobster and Las Vegas visionary, intervened. How or why Siegel stepped in is unclear. Some say Rooney had run up gambling debts. Others claim he was being mistreated by the studio system. Either way, once Siegel got involved, the problem disappeared. Rooney himself hinted at having powerful friends in interviews, but never named names. He also spent significant time performing in Las Vegas, often at casinos linked to mob families, and was a known high-stakes gambler. Many believe he stayed afloat financially thanks to favors granted by those operating outside the law. He was never accused of wrongdoing, but Rooney's longevity in the industry, despite repeated personal and professional crises, has long raised eyebrows. Mickey Rooney was the golden boy who refused to fade. And in a town where survival often came with strings, it's possible those strings were held by someone a little more dangerous than a producer or agent. From ballrooms to backrooms, these stars walked a line between fame and danger. Some danced willingly, others were dragged by circumstance, but all stood under a spotlight partially powered by shadows. Subscribe for more stories that pull back Hollywood's velvet curtain and reveal what really happened behind the scenes.